They threw a Doberman puppy from the 15th floor. What happened next will break you. I've been a veterinarian for more than 30 years. I've seen dogs crushed under wheels, cats left to starve in alleyways, and even burn victims so small my hands trembled as I stitched their skin back together. But that afternoon, that was the first time in my life I ever heard the sound of a living being hitting the ground. It wasn't like an object falling. It was heavier, wetter, carrying something that froze the air itself. A single thud, dry and final, then silence. For a moment, all of Portland stopped breathing. I looked up and saw only a black speck against the blinding sky twisting through the sunlight as tiny strands of fur scattered like ash. I screamed and ran across the crowded street. Someone dropped their coffee, someone else pulled their child close, and then we all saw it lying motionless on the red brick pavement. A Doberman puppy so small it could fit between my two hands. I dropped to my knees. My heart shattered with every beat. It didn't whimper, didn't cry. Only its eyes were open wide, clouded, caught somewhere between life and death. Its fur was smeared with blood and concrete dust, its breath thin as thread. I pressed my hand to its chest. There was still a heartbeat. One beat, then another, then fading. "Call an ambulance," I shouted. A teenage boy rushed forward, fumbling with his phone. From somewhere above, a voice screamed. It was the old man in 1507. I saw him throw it. I looked up. The windows of the high-rise loomed cold and indifferent. Hundreds of glass eyes staring down. 15th floor. A half-closed door. A curtain fluttered. No one appeared. I tore off my lab coat and wrapped the puppy tight. Blood soaked through hot and sticky, but my hands wouldn't stop. It moved barely. Its mouth twitched open and its tail flicked once, weak as a dying spark. I broke down, not as a doctor, as a woman who had just witnessed something too cruel to believe humans capable of. The ambulance siren wailed from the end of the block. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the first autumn rain as it hit the scorching street. I ran, cradling her in my arms. Each step was a prayer. "Hold on, little one. Just breathe. One more breath." When the doors closed, she lay on the steel tray so tiny the oxygen tube looked thicker than her neck. The paramedic asked, "What's her name?" I shook my head. Nobody knew. No collar, no chip, no owner. Only a small tattoo behind her right ear. Faded letters hastily inked FPPRG7. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I wouldn't let her die nameless. Then a man approached, tall, broad-shouldered, in a worn leather jacket. He showed his badge, Detective Daniel Brooks, Portland PD. "I got the call from the 15th floor," he said quietly. "The suspect's an elderly man, lives alone. Signs of dementia. Neighbors say he thought the puppy attacked him." I looked him straight in the eye. "He threw her off the building." Daniel exhaled. "I know, but he's not really himself anymore." I said nothing. Because some sins aren't born of malice, they come from hearts that have been broken too long to remember what love is. I held her tiny paw tighter. "You're not going to die, sweetheart. Not while this doctor is still breathing." The siren screamed as the van sped through the rain-slicked streets. Outside the window, Portland blurred by red lights streaking into ribbons. On my lap, the puppy trembled, her breathing, shallow eyes fluttering closed, yet her paw clung to my fingers as if terrified that letting go meant falling again. I bent close and whispered, "They can call you property, or a mutt, or worthless, but to me you're a life that deserves to stay." And when those tiny eyes finally closed, I knew this wasn't just another rescue. It was a war, and I'd just been chosen to fight it. My emergency clinic sits on the corner of Burnside in the damp heart of Portland, where morning fog and the scent of coffee always mix with the groan of passing trucks. We call it the Heartline Animal Emergency Center, a converted firehouse, low ceiling, red brick paint peeling off the old sign. Every day, I open the door to that familiar creak and think, if I can save someone from pain today, that's one more reason to stay. When Kota arrived, the wall clock read 12:47. Rain slammed suddenly against the tin roof and the wind slipped through the cracks like a voice moaning in the dark. I took off my coat, pulled on gloves, and looked down at the steel table where the tiny body lay still. Black and tan fur, belly swollen from internal trauma, breathing in short broken bursts. But those eyes, God, those eyes wouldn't let me look away. They weren't the terrified eyes of an abused animal. They were the eyes of a young soldier, one who already knew she was fighting a battle with no one on her side. I brushed her head gently. "It's okay, Kota. You're safe now." Daniel Brooks stood in the corner, arms crossed, rein still clinging to his shoulders. He had retired from the Portland police 4 years ago, yet they still called him for cases that aren't crimes but feel like them. His eyes were gray, calm, sad, the kind that had seen too much cruelty to be surprised anymore. "I went up to the 15th floor," he said quietly. "The man's name is Walter Green, 79, lives alone, diagnosed with dementia and PTSD. When I asked him, he said, 'The dog tried to attack me.'" "He threw her?" I asked. Daniel nodded. "Doesn't remember much. But the leash was broken and the balcony door was open." He exhaled, gaze drifting away. "I saw men like him in the service. When the mind cracks, it can't tell the difference between defense and harm." I looked down at Kota. "So, is he the victim? Or the culprit? Maybe both?" Daniel murmured. Then he looked at me, his voice low but steady. "And that little one, der Hart. If she survives, she'll make a lot of people question their own humanity." I said nothing. I'd saved many lives, but never felt something like this, as if a fragile thread had tied her heartbeat to mine. I lost my husband 10 years ago in an accident. Since then, I never kept anything too close, afraid of losing it again. But when my hand touched Kota's tiny paw, I knew this time I couldn't let go. A young nurse cut away the blood-soaked collar and placed it in a tray. Beneath the fur, a small tattoo appeared, FPPRG7. Daniel leaned closer. "See that FP stands for Federal Protective Service, a government program for training service dogs. PRG likely means Program Group 7. I frowned. Even a puppy has a code like that. Yes, they're chosen at 6 weeks old, raised under strict conditions. If they get injured or fail to adapt, they're eliminated. Eliminated. I repeated the word bitter in my mouth. "You mean killed?" Daniel didn't answer. I took a deep breath and pressed my palm to Kota's chest. Beneath the damp, cold fur, her heart still beat faint, but defiant. "Not today," I whispered. "Not while I'm still standing." Outside, the rain thickened. Daniel turned to leave, but before closing the door, he said, "If you're going to fight for her, be ready. You're not just up against hospitals or the government. You're up against people's habit of treating life as disposable." I looked at Kota one last time before drawing the curtain. She slept, breathing shallowly, but every time the monitor beeped, her tail twitched a tiny promise that she hadn't surrendered. And I understood. From that moment on, I wasn't just a veterinarian anymore. I was the keeper of the last heartbeat of a soul the world had thrown away. And no matter what it took, I would not let Portland become the place where she drew her final breath. The storm that night came earlier than forecast. Wind slammed against the emergency room windows as if it wanted to tear the frame apart. The clock read nearly 11 when a long, flat beep cut through the rain-soaked air. Kota twitched. The IV line trembled. I rushed over, my heartbeat louder than the storm itself. Blood pressure dropping. Pulse irregular. Her small eyes opened cloudy behind the oxygen mask, searching for me through the haze. I pressed my hand against her chest and whispered, "It's okay, baby. I'm right here." Everything in the room seemed to stop. The rain, the machines, the fragile rhythm of a creature clinging to something beyond instinct. "Should I call another doctor?" the nurse asked. I shook my head. No, keep it steady. Kota didn't need more hands. She needed someone who wouldn't leave. I leaned closer, listening to her shallow breaths push weakly through her chest. And then I saw it. Not fear, not pleading, but a question. Am I still worth saving? I drew in a shaky breath. "Yes, sweetheart," I murmured. "You are, no matter what this world says." I adjusted the fluids, retied the splint, and wrapped gauze around her ribs. I'd done those motions thousands of times, but tonight, every movement felt like a vow. The lights flickered, then went out. Thunder cracked overhead as darkness flooded the room. 2 endless seconds later, the backup generator kicked in. 2 seconds enough for me to feel her tiny paw curl around my finger. Not a reflex, a grasp, a faint squeeze that said more than 1,000 help-me's. I looked up past the fogged glass window. Portland was swallowed by night. The only color left was the red reflection of emergency lights bleeding through the rain. The world outside kept moving, but inside it was just me and her betting everything on every breath. A knock came at the door. Daniel stepped in, coat drenched, a paper cup of cold coffee in his hand. He looked through the glass and saw me bent over the puppy arms, wrapped around her, and said softly, "Brought you some caffeine. You haven't eaten since morning." I didn't answer. He came closer, set the cup beside the medicine tray, and looked at Kota for a long moment. "She's tough," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "but she's fighting alone." "Not really." He smiled. "You're here." I looked at him, managed a tired smile, one that trembled like my hands. "Do you ever think," I asked, "that some animals are born to teach us loyalty only to be betrayed by the very people they trust?" Daniel nodded. "I've seen it, on the battlefield, and in life." The door closed again. It was just me, now, the monitor's steady beep and the soft thump of Kota's heart. As I cleaned the blood along her side, I noticed something odd. Beneath the patchy fur were thin parallel scars, too precise for an accident, too deep to be recent. Chain marks. I froze. She hadn't just been thrown from the 15th floor. She'd been tied up long before that. A chill crawled down my spine. I pulled off my gloves and stepped into the hallway. "Daniel," I called. "You said Walter Green lives alone, right?" "That's right. But that chain was new and these scars are old. Someone else had her first, someone who kept her in conditions worse than a cage." Daniel was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Then maybe he wasn't the first." I looked through the glass again. Kota stirred in her sleep, legs twitching as if running, maybe still escaping even in dreams. I turned back to Daniel, voice shaking but firm. "I'm going to find out where she came from. I need to know who taught her to fear the light." He studied me, then nodded slowly. "You know, Evelyn," he said, "I used to think people like you were crazy. Now I think this world needs more of that kind of crazy." I smiled faintly. "Not crazy, Daniel. Faith. I believe she'll make it. And I believe if a puppy can survive a fall from the 15th floor and still want to live, then we have no right to give up." Outside, the sky was still black. But somewhere in that darkness, I heard something new, a breath deeper and stronger than before. Kota was still here. And I knew. The real storm had only just begun, the third night after the fall. Portland lay under an unusual storm wind, shrieking as if it meant to tear each window pane away, and I was still on duty alone beside Kota, while the operating room lights flickered the white beam skimming over her face, half angel, half ghost. She slept with her head on the stuffed rabbit Daniel had brought, and every so often her legs twitched as if she were running in a dream. I wondered whether in that dream she was fleeing someone or trying to find the place she once belonged. Thunder cracked directly above the roof, and the power blinked out, leaving only the stuttering light of the monitor. A long beep announced a sudden drop in the heart rate, and I lunged across the room as the oxygen reading plunged to 62%, Kota's eyes opening and panting through the mask, while the IV line stretched taut. I pressed my hand to the portable oxygen tank and twisted the valve, upping the flow, to keep that breath from stalling, and outside the rain hammered harder until a bolt of lightning whitened the room, and then, with a deafening bang, the auxiliary lights died, and for a sliver of an instant I heard only ragged breaths and the burnt ozone smell of fried wiring. I fumbled for a flashlight, and its thin beam fell across the small, shivering body on the table. I did what a veterinarian is never supposed to do and cut the line, scooped her up. "We have to get out of here, Kota. It's not safe." I ran through the dark corridor with rainwater sluicing in under the doors, the ceiling weeping drops that hit my bare skin hot and stinging, and Kota pressed to my chest light as ash and warm as coals, making a tiny whimper that I almost mistook for the wind. At the back step, Daniel called my name, soaked and carrying a fire extinguisher smoke staining his coat, and shouted that the main panel had shorted and we had to leave immediately. I told him I had Kota, and he waved me this way, and we splashed down the hall with water up to our ankles, each lightning flash revealing her face, wet, dust-streaked eyes still fixed on me. Not afraid, just trusting. We stumbled into the old X-ray room where the backup generator runs on a separate line, and I set Kota on the wooden table panting as I wiped her down. Daniel warned me I shouldn't be holding her like that, and I told him if I hadn't, she would have suffocated in the dark. I restarted the monitor with shaking hands, and a weak beep sputtered, then another, then one more, and I wept. He fished a pack of peppermint candies from his pocket and tossed them over. "You need sugar. For the heart and the head," he said, and I smiled through tears and said thank you. As the storm eased, we sat in silence and watched Kota, sleep curled against the rabbit. Her breathing, even her fragile life, reflected in the flashlight's glint in her eyes. Daniel said quietly that people were already talking about what to do with her, that some considered her property of the security program, and that an injury like this could mean euthanasia. I looked up, my voice raw. They would actually say that. He told me he'd just received the email. "No," I said, staring at Kota and then at him. "No, not after everything she's already been through." He shrugged that procedures are procedures, and I laughed a bitter, dry laugh. If lives are measured by procedure, then none of us deserve to live. I stood and looked out the wet window, the storm gone, but rivulets still streaming down the glass, and in that distorted reflection, I saw myself, hair mussed, coat stained with blood, arms wrapped around a life the world was preparing to erase. I whispered, almost a prayer, "No one has the right to decide the fate of a creature that chose to live." Kota shifted, and her small ears flicked. She opened her eyes and looked at me, then wagged her tail, once painfully slow. I leaned down so our noses touched and whispered, "You survived the fall. Now it's my turn to fight." Daniel's tired eyes brightened. "If you're going to fight Evelyn, I'm coming with you," he said. I nodded, and for the first time in a long while, the dim light in two middle-aged faces, people who thought they were too old to start a battle, caught and held steady. That night in Portland's damp room, with Kota's breath mixing with the wind's sigh, I knew this fight had only just begun. The storm had passed. The sky over Portland was a pale gray, the trees dripping wet, the scent of damp soil mixing with disinfectant in the air. I sat on the wooden chair in the recovery room, a cup of cold coffee in my hands. Kota lay only a few steps away, still alive, still breathing, her small body wrapped in white bandages. The wounds had closed, but the look in her eyes hadn't. 3 days after the blackout, the clinic phone rang hundreds of times. Not about the dog thrown from the 15th floor, but about the Doberman puppy who survived. The news spread faster than the rain. A group of older women from the neighborhood formed what they called the Rose Circle. They brought pies, daisies, and little handwritten notes that said, "Stay strong, sweetheart. You still have sunlight to see." They lit candles outside the window and prayed every night. Each time I stepped out, they only smiled, saying nothing, but I knew that in their eyes they weren't just praying for Kota. They were praying for themselves. Women who had lost something and now clung to this tiny creature as proof that miracles might still exist. On the 4th morning, when I opened the door, Kota was trying to stand. Her front legs trembled, her head swayed, but she tried. "Easy, sweetheart," I gasped. She took one step, then collapsed. I rushed forward, but before I could reach her, she lifted her head and wagged her tail just once, faintly, but unmistakably. My heart caught in my throat. I started crying, and didn't even know why, maybe because after all these years in this job, I still wasn't used to watching a creature choose life when no one had asked it to. That afternoon, Daniel came back. He found me kneeling beside Kota and smiled wearily. "You haven't slept, have you?" I did, I said. In the dream, I heard her calling. "A dog's bark?" "No," I said softly. "The sound of life." Daniel placed a folder on the table. "Bad news," he said. "They're reviewing her for euthanasia. She's been classified as damaged property from the government program. No claimant, no retraining value." I stayed silent, my hand resting on her chest. Her warmth was steady. I looked at Daniel and spoke slowly. "They can call her whatever they want, but to me she's a soul, and I won't let anyone touch that soul." He sat down beside me, the late light brushing across his weathered face, a face hardened by wars, softened by time. "Evelyn, you know, this won't be easy. You're just a veterinarian, alone." "I've been alone for 10 years, I said, "but I've never found loneliness this worth it." Daniel let out a rough laugh. "You really are insane." I know I smiled, but sometimes it takes a mad person to keep a life alive. Kota, stirred, let out a soft whimper, not from pain, but response. I bent down and touched her head. "You hear that, baby? They may have laws, papers, and power, but we have each other." She opened her eyes. Those dark eyes reflected me, and the tears I hadn't wiped away. For the first time since the fall, Kota looked at me without fear. And in that moment I knew from this day on, she wasn't just my patient anymore. She was a reminder that even in the coldest world, trust can still grow from a body full of scars. That morning, Portland felt strangely cold. The sky was veiled in fog, the sunlight silver and metallic. I was giving Kota her medication when the email notification chimed a small sound, but it tightened something deep inside my chest. I opened it. Official notice, behavioral assessment conclusion. Subject, FP-PRG7, deemed unfit for retraining. Euthanasia procedure scheduled for Friday, 12:00 p.m. The words read like a sentence carved in stone. I read them again and again. Kota lay quietly in her bed, eyes half closed, unaware that somewhere someone had just decided her fate with a single keystroke. I stood up and walked outside. The cold air cut through my lab coat like glass. Daniel sat on the steps, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. I handed him my phone. My voice was so hoarse I barely recognized it. "They're going to kill her." He read the message, then looked up, eyes heavy. "They call it procedure," he said. "I call it cowardice." We sat in silence for a long time. A crow cried from the roof above, its voice scraping the air like metal on metal. Finally, I said, "I'm not going to let them do this. I'll go on television." Daniel turned toward me. "You know they won't like that. I don't need them to like it," I said. "I just need them to listen." That afternoon, we stood in front of the local news cameras. My hands trembled, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. "Her name is Kota," I began. "She was thrown from the 15th floor and survived, and now the very system that trained her plans to end her life. If the courage of one living soul isn't enough to make them ashamed, then at least let our compassion speak for us." The studio fell silent. Kota rested in my arms, her white brace catching the glare of the lights. Daniel stood behind me, eyes red, trying to stand tall. The segment aired that night, and then everything exploded. Within hours, social media was flooded with Kota's image. People painted portraits, wrote poems, lit candles outside the clinic. A hashtag appeared, #LetKotaLive. The entire city rose up. Widows, veterans, people who had lost someone, they all wrote, "Don't kill her. She's the last thing that makes us believe in humanity." But just as hope was spreading, I got a call from the Federal Protective Service. A woman's voice, cold and metallic, said, "Dr. Hart, you've overstepped your authority. All appeals for delay have been denied." According to prior reports, the subject previously displayed aggressive behavior toward a civilian at an airport last year. I froze. What, Kota is 5 months old? That's impossible. We are simply following protocol. "Doctor?" I hung up. Daniel walked in and saw my face drained of color. "What now?" I told him. He frowned. "I know the doctor who supervised that incident. Amelia Rhodes, she's in Tucson now. She can tell the truth." I looked at Kota, then at him. "Then we're going to Tucson." "I'll drive," he said. When I turned back, Kota had pushed herself upright, tired but alert. I stroked her head and whispered, "Listen, sweetheart. They want to write your ending, but I'm the one holding the pen." Kota blinked. Her tail moved once, a small flick like a punctuation mark, a silent promise. And I knew then this journey was no longer about saving a dog. It was about helping people rediscover the best part of themselves in a world ruled by soulless rules. We reached Tucson under a scorching afternoon sun. The desert stretched endlessly, and the hot wind sliced against our faces like dry blades. The woman who opened the door was Dr. Amelia Rhodes, thin, prematurely gray, and carrying in her eyes the quiet light of someone who had seen too much and still chose to believe. I told her everything. Amelia went silent for a long moment, then opened a drawer and pulled out an old yellowed folder. Her voice was hoarse, as if each word had to climb out from the weight of a buried memory. That day, there was no civilian attack. A security panel fell from the ceiling. The puppy ran toward the child and pushed him out of the way. The blood on the floor was hers. She signed a statement, a simple declaration, but I knew it was the key that could save Kota's life. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the Federal Security Department euthanasia order. Revoked. Subject FPPRG7 is reinstated with the right to life and approved for the Therapy Companion program. I cried as I read those words, not because we had won, but because for once justice had looked down and seen a dog. 6 months later, Portland bloomed into spring again. Kota had grown ears, standing tall, black and tan coat, gleaming under the sun. She wore a blue vest embroidered with Therapy Companion, Brave Hearts program. On her first day in her new role, she walked gently into the rehabilitation center for widows and veterans. A woman in a wheelchair named Ruth, 74 years old, had just lost her husband after 52 years of marriage. Kota approached her, barking, no hesitation, just pressed her muzzle softly against Ruth's wrinkled hand, and Ruth cried. "I thought I couldn't feel anything anymore," she whispered, but she made me remember that my heart still beats. I stood at the corner of the room watching. Beside me, Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder and smiled faintly. You gave her life back, he said. I shook my head, eyes stinging. No, Daniel. She gave it back to all of us. That evening I walked Kota along the Willamette River. The wind rippled over the water and the sunset brushed her ears in glimmers of gold. She looked up at me, the same clear gaze from the first day we met, but now without fear. Only peace. Around her neck hung a silver tag I had made myself, Kota. Loved, wanted, home. I smiled and said softly, "The 15th floor was where they threw you away. But this ground, this is where you learned to stand. If you're hearing this story, please share it. Because somewhere out there are still other Kotas, and sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to give up to bring them back to life. Thank you for staying until the end. If you cried for Kota, know that your tears were not in vain. Because your compassion, that single act of feeling, is the reason souls like hers get another chance to live, to love, to see the sun again. Share this story to remind each other that saving a life doesn't just change its fate, it heals your own heart too. And if you want to walk this journey with us, subscribe not to count numbers, but to add another hand to the circle of those who still believe in kindness. My name is Evelyn Hart, and I promise as long as I still draw breath, I will keep telling the stories the world tried to forget.